All right, in this video, we're going to discuss Locke's approach to private property, specifically his labor account of property. So the general question that we're going to try to understand and figure out here is just simply, what is the justification for private property? And hence, what is going to be the justification for a free market capitalist society or a capitalist economy? Which, of course, Locke thinks is tied hand in hand with his approach to limited government that protects natural rights, specifically a right to property, right? Okay, so we can think about Locke's argument then as beginning from a place of tension. It begins by considering two different claims or statements that Locke definitely endorses, but they look like they're just inconsistent with one another. The first claim says, all men share everything in common equally, right? So again, think about this in terms of his kind of egalitarian approach. God creates all rational men equally with the same right to everything else. So it's the job of men, according to Locke, to be stewards of everything because we share everything in common, right? So that's the first claim. The second claim says, all men have a right to private property. So how could that be? How is it that all men can share everything in common and at the same time have a right to private property? It looks like that's just kind of a contradiction, or at least inconsistent with one another, right? And so that's what we need to figure out. So the argument then proceeds as follows. Locke argues that all men, all rational men, owns their bodies, right? I own my body, you own your bodies, and nobody can take that away from us, right? Even if you kill me, nonetheless, you haven't taken my body as property away from me. I'm just now dead. And insofar as I go on living, even if I'm chained, enslaved, or living a terrible life, nonetheless, I still own my body. I have a certain kind of autonomy that corresponds with my rationality, and that allows me to do anything I want with my body because I own it. I own my body as private property. So he thinks that that's just a straightforward, kind of a self-evident truth that's not something that we can dispute. You own your body. I own my body. So my body is property. That's where we begin. Next, Locke argues that we can use our bodies to labor in certain ways, right? So if, I use my body to build a table, that's using my body to labor, to work in a certain way. If I use my body to harvest crops, I'm using my body, the thing that I own, to produce a good of some sort, right? So I can use my body to labor, right? So given those first two sort of premises, we then proceed to say that when we do go about mixing our labor with our bodies in such a way that we're able to produce certain goods, when we do that, that's when we are able to generate private property, private ownership, right? When we mix the labor of our bodies with that which is produced, we then own that thing, that good. So think about it like this. Again, think about it in terms of building a table, right? So if I'm using my body, which I own, to build a table, I produce this good, a table, and I somehow transfer my ownership of my body through my labor into this object, this good that I've built, the table. And so now I own that table as private property. Likewise, if I am, harvesting some crop, let's say I'm growing some corn, and doing so and use my body, which I own, to labor and to work, I then transfer my ownership of my body to that good that I'm producing, the corn or the harvest or what have you. And then we can generalize this basic sort of transferring of my ownership of my body to the good that I'm producing. We can generalize that to numerous other things, right? So anytime, according to Locke, anytime we mix the labor of our bodies with whatever it is that we produce, we thereby own that thing. It's private property that nobody has a right to take away from us. So this is the basis of Locke's approach to private property and ownership and so forth. Now, there are some things that we need to pay attention to, some limitations that Locke specifies. So on the one hand, Locke thinks that we have ownership of those things that we produce through the mixing of our labor with those objects, but only insofar as there's enough for everyone else, right? So if I'm growing some corn, then if there's a surplus of corn, then it needs to be able to feed those other people that don't have corn, right? So I can produce certain goods for myself, but only if there's enough for other people too. So that's an important caveat, because you might think that there's lots of situations in our contemporary society where certain companies, certain individuals, certain countries, let's say, are producing lots and lots of goods, and they're not going to help those people without those goods, right? Certain people that starve without having enough food, and there's lots of food. We could grow plenty of food for different communities throughout the world, right? The second caveat that we should think about is Locke says that we should not produce so much that it goes to waste, right? So another way of thinking about that is I shouldn't grow so much corn that a bunch of it spoils, a bunch of it goes bad. He thinks that would not be a good steward of our goods. And again, this goes back to his view of the state of nature, where God creates us to be a steward of the things that we're responsible for, that we're ruling over. And so if I were to produce so much corn, even though I own it as property, nonetheless, if it's all wasted because it spoils, then that would not be a legitimate form of property and ownership. So that's the basis then of Locke's view of a kind of a capitalist society or a capitalist economic system. But there's one question that remains fundamental to Locke's approach, which I think is oftentimes overlooked. And that's the question of what about money? Notice that money is not the sort of thing that we produce, right? So when I go and I build a table, I can sell the table for money, but the money itself is sort of like a placeholder for the value of the table. It's not something that I produced. The table is what I produced. So that's one initial problem, is how should we understand the notion of private ownership as it relates to money, because money is not something that we produce. Second, money doesn't spoil, right? Notice that you can produce lots and lots and lots of money. Well, you wouldn't produce it, but you can acquire lots and lots of money, but it never actually spoils. It's not like corn. It's not going to spoil. It's not like a table that can be destroyed, right? So how should we understand the notion of commerce and money? This is an unresolved question, but it looks like Locke used this point about money as a kind of a loophole in order to justify colonialism and expansion, massive expansion of wealth, of property ownership, of citizens that are being recognized as citizens because of their wealth, because of their property ownership, right? And again, this goes right back to his understanding of natural rights and who has a right to give authority to a sovereign ruling class of people. Well, for Locke, it's going to be those people that are property owners, those people that have a certain amount of wealth, those people that have used their bodies and their labor in some form in order to acquire a certain amount of political authority, right? If you weren't property owners, then you couldn't elect the ruling class of people. You couldn't elect the political leaders, right? So the more power you had was tied to how much property and wealth you had. This, you might think, is very problematic insofar as those people that lack any property or lack the right amount of property or right amount of wealth were left out of the game. They were sort of left out of the political process. You might think that is fundamentally at odds with Locke's view that we're all created equal, endowed by a creator with certain inalienable rights, like right to life, liberty, property, and so forth. So that's where I'm going to leave things for this video. And the next video, we're going to finish off by discussing Locke's view of the downfall of government.